We think we know Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, the rail splitter from Illinois, the melancholy president who held the Union together. But this familiar portrait misses the most essential element of his character, the profound spiritual transformation that made him not merely a political leader, but a moral prophet who saved America's soul. What if I told you that Lincoln's greatest strength wasn't his political cunning or his rhetorical brilliance, but something far more fundamental, a wrestling with Providence that shaped every crucial decision of his presidency? In my decades studying great leaders, from Churchill to Napoleon, I've learned that the men who truly change history are those who understand they serve something greater than themselves. Lincoln's faith wasn't the conventional piety of his era, but a deep, biblical wrestling with divine purpose that transformed a prairie lawyer into the instrument of America's moral redemption. Chapter 1: The Making of a Moral Mind. Lincoln's spiritual journey began not in triumph but in tragedy, shaped by the harsh realities of frontier life where death was intimate and faith was essential for survival. Born into a world where the Bible was often the only book in the household, young Abraham absorbed its rhythms and moral framework even as he questioned conventional religious orthodoxy. His stepmother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, provided the nurturing that cultivated his compassionate nature, while his father's rigid Calvinist beliefs created the tension that would later manifest in Lincoln's own complex relationship with Providence. The death of his beloved sister Nancy and later his first love, Anne Rutledge, plunged Lincoln into periods of profound melancholy that his contemporaries recognized as something deeper than mere depression. These early encounters with mortality forced him to grapple with questions of meaning and purpose that would define his character. Unlike the shallow optimism of his political contemporaries, Lincoln developed what I call a tragic sense of life, an understanding that human existence is shot through with suffering, yet somehow redeemed by moral purpose. His legal career in Springfield revealed a man whose sense of justice was grounded not in legal technicalities but in fundamental moral principles. Colleagues noted how Lincoln would refuse cases he believed morally wrong, even when they promised substantial fees. His famous declaration that a lawyer's time and advice are his stock in trade was tempered by his deeper conviction that some things matter more than profit. This wasn't mere sentimentality but the practical application of a worldview shaped by biblical concepts of justice and mercy. The transformation of a frontier lawyer into America's moral conscience required years of quiet preparation. Lincoln's voracious reading of Shakespeare, Burns, and Byron cultivated an appreciation for human complexity, while his study of Euclid trained his mind in logical reasoning. But it was his constant engagement with Scripture that provided the moral vocabulary he would later use to frame America's greatest crisis. He understood, long before he reached the presidency, that leadership requires not just political skill but moral clarity about the fundamental questions of right and wrong. Chapter 2: Faith Tested in the Crucible of Crisis. The presidency thrust Lincoln into a crisis that would have broken a lesser man, but it was precisely in this crucible that his faith matured from private questioning into public prophecy. The outbreak of war challenged every assumption about American progress and divine favor. While his contemporaries spoke confidently of God blessing their cause, Lincoln struggled with the terrible possibility that the war itself might be God's judgment on the entire nation for the sin of slavery. The death of his 11-year-old son Willie in February 1862 shattered the Lincoln family and drove the president into the darkest period of his life. Mary Todd Lincoln's descent into spiritualism and seances reflected the era's desperate search for comfort, but Abraham's response was characteristically different. Rather than seeking easy consolation, he wrestled with the problem of suffering in ways that echo Job's confrontation with the Almighty. Secretary John Hay observed Lincoln spending entire nights reading the Bible, searching for understanding that went beyond political calculation. This personal agony coincided with the military disasters of 1862, the Peninsula Campaign's failure, the Union defeat at Second Bull Run, the horrific casualties at Antietam. Lesser leaders might have sought scapegoats or retreated into cynicism, But Lincoln's response revealed the depth of his spiritual maturation. He began to speak of the war not as a conflict between right and wrong, but as a divine testing of the entire nation's commitment to its founding principles. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation emerged from this spiritual wrestling match. Lincoln told his cabinet he had made a covenant with God: if the Union forces could drive Lee from Maryland, he would free the slaves. This wasn't political theater but the authentic expression of a man who had come to believe that American slavery was a sin that required atonement. The proclamation's careful legal language concealed a moral revolution. Lincoln had moved from viewing slavery as a political problem to understanding it as a spiritual crisis requiring divine intervention. His growing conviction that Providence was using the war to purge America of slavery transformed Lincoln from a cautious politician into a moral prophet. He began to speak of this nation under God, with an understanding that American democracy was not merely a political experiment but a divine test of whether people could govern themselves according to moral principles. This wasn't the comfortable civil religion of his era but a demanding faith that called the nation to account for its deepest contradictions. Chapter 3: The Biblical President. Lincoln's speeches during the war years reveal a mind steeped in biblical language and concepts, drawing on Scripture not as political decoration but as the fundamental framework for understanding America's crisis. His use of biblical imagery wasn't merely rhetorical flourish but reflected a genuine conviction that the American experiment was unfolding within a larger divine drama of human redemption. The Gettysburg Address, that masterpiece of American prose, draws its power from Lincoln's transformation of a battlefield dedication into a meditation on sacrifice and renewal reminiscent of the Psalms. When he spoke of the dead who had consecrated the battlefield far above our poor power to add or detract, he was applying fundamentally religious concepts to secular events. The address's final promise of a new birth of freedom echoed Christ's teaching about spiritual rebirth, suggesting that the war itself was purging America of its original sin. His Second Inaugural Address represents perhaps the finest expression of Christian statesmanship in American history. Rather than claiming divine blessing for Union victory, Lincoln offered a theology of national judgment that held both North and South accountable for slavery's evil. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove. This wasn't the language of political calculation but of prophetic understanding. The address's conclusion, with malice toward none, with charity for all, revealed how deeply Lincoln had internalized Christ's teaching about forgiveness. Having spent 4 years wrestling with the problem of divine justice, he emerged with a vision of reconstruction based not on vengeance but on reconciliation. This represented a revolutionary application of Christian principles to political reality, transforming what could have been a war of conquest into an opportunity for national redemption. Lincoln's private moments revealed the same biblical orientation. His secretary John Hay recorded conversations where the president would quote scripture extensively, not as proof texts for predetermined positions but as genuine efforts to understand God's will in current events. Unlike the shallow piety of many politicians, Lincoln's faith was marked by intellectual honesty about divine mystery and human limitation. This biblical worldview shaped every major decision of his presidency. From the Emancipation Proclamation to his plans for Reconstruction, Lincoln consistently applied Christian principles of justice, mercy, and reconciliation to the practical problems of governance. He understood that American democracy required moral foundations deeper than mere popular will, foundations that could only be secured through national commitment to transcendent moral principles. Chapter 4: Confronting the Intellectual's Temptation. Lincoln's greatness lay partly in his ability to resist the intellectual's characteristic vice, the substitution of abstract theory for moral reality. While his contemporary intellectuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson crafted elegant philosophies that ignored slavery's concrete evils, Lincoln remained grounded in the biblical understanding that ideas must be judged by their fruits in human life. The intellectual climate of Lincoln's era was dominated by various forms of romanticism that elevated feeling over moral judgment. Transcendentalists like Thoreau could afford the luxury of abstract principled opposition to slavery because they bore no responsibility for practical governance. Lincoln, facing the actual work of ending slavery while preserving the Union, couldn't indulge in such theoretical purity. His approach combined unwavering moral conviction with practical wisdom about what was actually achievable. Unlike the secular intellectuals of his era who increasingly viewed religion as obsolete superstition, Lincoln understood that effective leadership requires moral foundations that transcend human reason. His debates with Stephen Douglas revealed this fundamental difference. While Douglas appealed to popular sovereignty and legal technicalities, Lincoln grounded his opposition to slavery in the moral principles of the Declaration of Independence and the biblical understanding of human dignity. Lincoln's intellectual honesty extended to acknowledging the complexity of divine providence. While abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison proclaimed God's unambiguous support for their cause, Lincoln maintained what I call theological humility, recognition that human beings cannot fully comprehend divine purposes. This prevented him from the spiritual pride that corrupted many reform movements of his era. His approach to the Constitution exemplified this integration of principle and prudence. Rather than treating it as merely a legal document subject to clever interpretation, Lincoln understood it as an attempt to embody moral principles in practical governance. His argument that slavery violated the Declaration's principle that all men are created equal wasn't legal sophistry but moral reasoning grounded in biblical anthropology. The president's relationship with radical Republicans revealed another dimension of his intellectual integrity. While they demanded immediate abolition regardless of consequences, Lincoln insisted on connecting moral goals with practical possibilities. His gradual approach to emancipation reflected not moral compromise but deeper understanding that lasting change requires careful attention to human realities. This intellectual approach extended to his understanding of democracy itself. Unlike contemporary theorists who viewed popular government as an end in itself, Lincoln understood it as a means to higher moral purposes. His famous formulation of democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people, implied a vision of popular sovereignty serving transcendent moral principles rather than mere majoritarian preference. Lincoln's greatest intellectual achievement was demonstrating that biblical faith enhances rather than diminishes rational analysis. His capacity for logical reasoning, honed by studying Euclid and practicing law, combined with biblical wisdom to produce a form of moral reasoning that was both rationally compelling and spiritually profound. Chapter 5: Patterns of Providence in American History. Lincoln's understanding of divine providence in American history offers timeless lessons for contemporary challenges to democratic governance. His conviction that the Civil War represented God's judgment on national sin provides a framework for understanding how moral failures inevitably produce political crises that demand spiritual as well as practical solutions. The pattern Lincoln identified, national prosperity breeding moral complacency, followed by crisis that forces moral reckoning, has repeated throughout American history. The founding generation's compromise with slavery created a moral contradiction that festered for 80 years before exploding into war. Lincoln recognized that no purely political solution could resolve this crisis because its roots were spiritual. The nation had to choose between its founding principles and its economic interests. His analysis of how the Kansas-Nebraska Act unleashed sectional conflict demonstrates remarkable insight into how moral relativism destroys political consensus. Stephen Douglas's doctrine of popular sovereignty appeared reasonable and democratic, but Lincoln understood that it represented the abandonment of moral principle in favor of expedient compromise. When fundamental questions of right and wrong become matters of local option, national unity becomes impossible. The president's Second Inaugural Address articulated a philosophy of national judgment that explains recurring crises in American democracy. Nations, like individuals, face periodic testing of their commitment to moral principles. The Civil War tested whether America would fulfill its founding promise of equality. Reconstruction tested whether the nation would choose reconciliation over vengeance. Subsequent crises have tested different aspects of democratic character. Lincoln's approach to national renewal offers hope for contemporary challenges. Rather than seeking to impose solutions through political force, he understood that lasting change requires what theologians call conversion, a fundamental reorientation of heart and mind toward moral truth. The Emancipation Proclamation succeeded not merely because of military necessity but because it appealed to the nation's better angels. His vision of America as humanity's last best hope wasn't nationalist arrogance but recognition of democracy's unique moral responsibility. If self-government fails in America, the implications extend far beyond national borders. This understanding gives urgency to preserving the moral foundations that make democratic liberty possible. The Lincoln precedent suggests that American renewal requires leaders willing to call the nation to account for its moral failures while pointing toward redemptive possibilities. This prophetic role demands the combination of intellectual honesty, moral courage, and spiritual humility that Lincoln exemplified. Such leaders must be willing to speak uncomfortable truths while maintaining hope for national transformation. Contemporary America faces challenges different in detail but similar in spiritual significance to those Lincoln confronted. The erosion of moral consensus, the substitution of ideology for principle, the loss of shared understanding about human dignity, these patterns echo the antebellum crisis that Lincoln navigated. His example suggests that recovery requires not just better policies but deeper spiritual renewal rooted in transcendent moral principles. Chapter 6: The Providence Behind the Presidency. The seemingly accidental events that placed Lincoln in the presidency reveal patterns of meaning that transcend mere political calculation. His path from prairie lawyer to president appears improbable until we recognize how Providence often works through apparent coincidences to place the right person in the crucial moment of national need. Lincoln's nomination at the 1860 Republican Convention resulted from a series of circumstances that his contemporaries viewed as fortunate accidents but which reveal deeper patterns of historical development. William Seward's frontrunner status collapsed partly because of his radical rhetoric that alarmed moderate Republicans. Lincoln's reputation for moderation and his careful positioning on slavery made him the compromise candidate who could unite the party while appealing to swing voters in crucial states. Yet this political calculation alone cannot explain Lincoln's emergence. His development as a moral thinker during the 1850s prepared him uniquely for the presidency's spiritual demands. The Kansas-Nebraska Act controversy forced him to articulate a principled opposition to slavery that went beyond mere sectional politics. His debates with Douglas demonstrated his capacity to frame complex moral issues in language that ordinary Americans could understand and embrace. The election of 1860 itself revealed how individual character shapes historical moments. Lincoln's decision to remain silent between his nomination and inauguration, refusing to compromise on slavery extension, demonstrated the moral courage that would define his presidency. Lesser men might have sought to avoid war through further compromise, but Lincoln understood that some principles cannot be negotiated away without destroying the moral foundations of democratic government. His pre-presidential experience as a circuit-riding lawyer provided unexpected preparation for national leadership. Traveling the Illinois countryside for months each year, Lincoln developed an intimate understanding of ordinary Americans' values and concerns. This grassroots knowledge would prove invaluable when he needed to maintain popular support for unpopular but necessary war measures. The timing of Lincoln's political maturation coincided remarkably with the nation's need for moral leadership. His spiritual development accelerated during the 1850s precisely when America's moral crisis was deepening. The man who entered politics as a pragmatic Whig emerged as a prophet capable of calling the nation to moral account. This wasn't mere political evolution but spiritual preparation for unprecedented challenges. Even Lincoln's physical appearance contributed to his effectiveness as a moral leader. His gaunt, melancholy features conveyed the weight of responsibility he carried, while his humble demeanor disarmed critics who might have resented more polished politicians. His very awkwardness became an asset, suggesting authenticity in an age of political artifice. The wartime expansion of presidential power under Lincoln established precedents that would prove crucial in subsequent national emergencies. His understanding that constitutional government sometimes requires extraordinary measures to preserve constitutional principles provided a framework for strong executive leadership during crisis. This wasn't arbitrary power but principled authority exercised in service of higher moral purposes. Lincoln's assassination at the moment of victory reveals perhaps the most mysterious aspect of his providential role. His death transformed him from a controversial political figure into a martyred symbol of national redemption, ensuring that his vision of America would endure beyond his lifetime. The timing suggests that his historical mission was complete. He had preserved the Union and ended slavery, leaving to others the complex work of reconstruction. Chapter 7: Lincoln's Legacy for Contemporary America. Lincoln's example offers essential guidance for contemporary America's struggle to maintain democratic governance amid deepening cultural divisions. His approach to national unity through moral clarity rather than political compromise provides a roadmap for leaders facing seemingly irreconcilable differences over fundamental principles. The president's insistence that democracy requires shared commitment to transcendent moral principles challenges contemporary relativism that treats all values as equally valid. Lincoln understood that self-government becomes impossible when citizens cannot agree on basic questions of right and wrong. His grounding of political argument in the Declaration's principle of human equality provided common ground that transcended sectional interests. His method of moral argumentation offers particular lessons for Christian engagement in public life. Rather than imposing religious authority on secular debate, Lincoln translated biblical principles into language accessible to all Americans. His Second Inaugural Address demonstrated how leaders can speak prophetically without appearing sectarian, calling the nation to moral account while acknowledging human limitations in understanding divine will. Lincoln's approach to political opposition provides a model for maintaining civility amid passionate disagreement. His description of Southerners as fellow Americans led astray by false principles rather than evil people motivated by malice enabled eventual reconciliation. Contemporary political discourse too often demonizes opponents rather than engaging their arguments, making compromise and eventual unity nearly impossible. The Lincoln precedent suggests that effective leadership requires what I call moral realism, the combination of unwavering principle with practical wisdom about what is actually achievable. His gradual approach to emancipation reflected not moral compromise but deeper understanding that lasting change requires careful attention to political possibilities and human psychology. His vision of America as humanity's test case for democratic government remains relevant as authoritarian alternatives gain appeal worldwide. Lincoln's argument that democracy depends on moral foundations rather than mere political procedures offers crucial insights for defending liberal institutions against both external threats and internal decay. The president's integration of faith and reason provides a model for overcoming the false choice between religious fundamentalism and secular materialism. His biblical worldview enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for rational analysis, suggesting that authentic faith strengthens rather than weakens intellectual integrity. Lincoln's understanding of national suffering as potentially redemptive offers hope for contemporary Americans discouraged by cultural conflict and political dysfunction. His conviction that crisis can purify as well as destroy suggests that current challenges might serve providential purposes if met with appropriate moral courage and spiritual humility. His example of leadership through moral persuasion rather than coercive power provides essential guidance for a democracy where political authority ultimately depends on popular consent. Lincoln's ability to maintain public support for unpopular but necessary policies demonstrates how principled leadership can educate as well as govern the American people. The legacy of Lincoln's biblical statesmanship suggests that American renewal requires leaders willing to risk political careers for moral principle while maintaining hope for national transformation. Such leaders must combine intellectual honesty about current challenges with unwavering commitment to the transcendent principles that make democratic liberty possible. In our own time of testing, we desperately need leaders capable of calling America back to its founding promise while charting a path toward fuller realization of human dignity and democratic possibility. Conclusion. Lincoln's true strength lay not in political cunning but in spiritual maturity that enabled him to serve as God's instrument for America's moral redemption. His faith transformed a prairie lawyer into a prophet who called the nation to choose between its founding principles and its convenient compromises. The man who saved the Union understood that preserving democracy requires more than military victory, it demands moral renewal rooted in transcendent truth. Lincoln's legacy reminds us that great leaders emerge not from political calculation but from spiritual preparation for moments when character determines a nation's destiny. His example suggests that American renewal in our own troubled time requires leaders willing to risk everything for moral principle while trusting that Providence works through human choices to achieve purposes greater than any individual can comprehend. The rail splitter who became democracy's greatest defender proved that faith, properly understood, enhances rather than diminishes our capacity to serve the common good.